Margaret Street James stood in the center of her silent, freezing living room, clutching a foreclosure notice that bore her distinguished family name. Just 1 year ago, she had toasted with expensive champagne to the happiest day of her life, the day she finally bullied her son into divorcing his mediocre wife, Hannah. Margaret truly believed she was protecting the Street James legacy from a quiet, unassuming leech. She never realized that Hannah wasn't the leech. She was the lifeline. By the time the truth surfaced, the bank was already changing the locks, and the silence in the mansion was deafening. The invitations for the annual Street James Summer Gala were heavy, cream-colored cardstock with gold leaf embossing. They cost $12 apiece to print, and there were 300 of them sitting in neat stacks on the mahogany dining table. Hannah Bennett, technically Hannah Street James, though her mother-in-law rarely used that name, without a subtle sneer, sat at the table, addressing each envelope by hand in impeccable calligraphy. Her wrist throbbed, but she didn't stop. It was 11:30 p.m. on a Tuesday. The loop on the L in Langston is sloppy. A voice cut through the quiet air. Hannah didn't flinch. She was used to Margaret manifesting in doorways like a bad omen. She looked up at her mother-in-law, a woman who, at 62, looked a sharp, surgical 45. Margaret was wearing a silk dressing gown that probably cost more than Hannah's first car. "I'll redo it, Margaret," Hannah said softly, reaching for a fresh envelope. "See that you do. The Langstons are old money, Hannah. They notice details. Unlike the people you grew up with, who I assume were happy just to receive mail that wasn't a bill." Margaret walked into the room, pouring herself a glass of water from the crystal pitcher Hannah had refilled 10 minutes ago. This was their dynamic. For 6 years, Hannah had been the invisible engine keeping the Street James family running, and for 6 years, Margaret had treated her like a squatter who had broken in and refused to leave. Oliver, Hannah's husband, was asleep upstairs. He was a consultant for his father's old firm, a job title that mostly involved 3-hour lunches and playing golf with potential clients. He was handsome, charming, and completely spineless when it came to his mother. "Is the caterer confirmed for the lobster bisque?" Margaret asked, examining her fingernails. "Yes, and I negotiated the price down by 15% because they made a mistake on the invoice last month," Hannah replied, sealing the Langston envelope. Margaret scoffed. "Please don't tell me you haggled. How embarrassing. We are Street Jameses, Hannah. We don't clip coupons." "It saved the household budget $3,000, Margaret. Money we need for the roof repairs." "We do not talk about money problems," Margaret snapped, her eyes flashing. "Especially not when the gala is approaching. Appearance is everything. If you look the part, you'd understand." She let her gaze drift over Hannah's messy bun and oversized t-shirt. It was a calculated insult. Hannah actually ran a successful freelance forensic accounting business from her laptop in the guest room, a fact Margaret conveniently ignored, referring to it as Hannah's little typing hobby. "Go to bed, Margaret," Hannah said, her patience thinning. "I'll finish these. Just make sure you do. And try not to look so tired tomorrow. Jessica Vanderbilt is bringing her daughter, Tiffany. I want Oliver to show them the gardens. Tiffany has just returned from Milan. She's a model, you know, radiant girl." Hannah paused, the pen hovering over the paper. The mention of Tiffany wasn't accidental. Tiffany Vanderbilt was Margaret's dream daughter-in-law, tall, blonde, absurdly wealthy, and vapid enough to be controlled. "I'm sure Oliver will be a gracious host," Hannah said coldly, "as he is my husband. For now, dear," Margaret murmured into her glass. "For now." The next evening, the gala was in full swing. The Street James estate, a sprawling colonial in Greenwich, Connecticut, looked magnificent. But only Hannah knew that the wine was bought on a credit card she had opened in her own name because Oliver's cards were maxed out. Only Hannah knew that the gardener Margaret bragged about was actually Hannah waking up at 5 a.m. on Saturdays to prune the hydrangeas. Oliver stood by the bar, looking dashing in his tuxedo, laughing loudly at a joke told by Mr. Henderson, the family attorney. Hannah stood near the kitchen, supervising the servers. She wore a simple navy dress she'd had for years. "There she is," a voice shrilled. Hannah turned to see Margaret approaching, flanked by Jessica Vanderbilt and the radiant Tiffany. Tiffany was indeed beautiful, wearing a shimmering silver gown that looked like it was made of liquid money. "Jessica, Tiffany, you know." "Hannah." Margaret introduced her with a pause that suggested she had forgotten Hannah's name. "Charmed," Tiffany said, barely making eye contact, before looking past Hannah toward Oliver. "Ollie looks so good, Mrs. Street James. He's been working out?" "He has," Margaret beamed. "He needs a woman who can keep up with his vitality. Someone with energy." Hannah smiled tightly. "Can I get anyone a drink?" "Oh, no, we're fine," Jessica said, looking down her nose. "Margaret, darling, tell us again about the summer house in the Hamptons. Are you opening it this year?" Hannah's stomach tightened. The summer house had been sold secretly 4 months ago to cover Oliver's gambling debts, a mess Hannah had cleaned up to save the family from scandal. Margaret had forbidden Hannah from telling anyone, preferring to pretend they were just renovating. "Oh, we might," Margaret lied smoothly. "Although, with Hannah's limitations, managing 2 estates is such a burden. It's hard to find good help these days, isn't it?" She laughed, and the other women joined in. Hannah stood there, the invisible servant, holding a tray of empty champagne flutes. At that moment, Oliver walked over. He didn't put his arm around Hannah. He didn't kiss her cheek. He smiled at Tiffany. "Tiffany, you made it," Oliver said, his eyes lighting up in a way they hadn't for Hannah in years. "I did, Ollie. Your mom was just telling me about the gardens." "Show me?" Tiffany purred, linking her arm through his. Oliver looked at Hannah. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, a tiny flicker of guilt, before Margaret cleared her throat. "Go on, Oliver. Hannah has dishes to clear," Margaret commanded. Oliver nodded. "Right. Catch you later, hon." He walked off with Tiffany. Margaret turned to Hannah, her face stripping of all pleasantry. "Don't look so pathetic," Margaret hissed. "If you were half the woman Tiffany is, you wouldn't have to worry about him wandering off. Now, go to the kitchen. The caterers are waiting for their check, and I certainly am not dealing with the tradespeople." Hannah watched them leave. She looked at the expensive crystal in her hand. For a second, she thought about smashing it against the wall. Instead, she took a deep breath, walked into the kitchen, and wrote the check from her own personal savings account. She didn't know it yet, but the check would bounce. Not because she didn't have the money, but because Margaret had gained access to Hannah's account that morning and drained it. The war had begun. The realization that her account was empty hit Hannah like a physical blow. She stood at the bank counter the following Monday, her hand trembling slightly as she held the receipt. "I don't understand," Hannah said to the teller. A kind woman named Mrs. Higgins, who had known the family for years. "There was $45,000 in there on Friday. My inheritance from my grandmother." Mrs. Higgins looked uncomfortable. She lowered her voice. "Mrs. Street James. The transfer was authorized by a joint holder. A Margaret Street James?" Hannah froze. "She's not on my account. According to the paperwork filed Saturday morning, she was added as a signatory, and the funds were moved to the Street James Family Trust." Hannah felt the blood drain from her face. She remembered Oliver asking her to sign a stack of tax documents last week. He had been rushing out the door, flustered, saying his mother needed them urgently for the estate planning. Hannah, trusting her husband, had signed where he pointed without reading the fine print. She had signed away her own safety net. Hannah drove home in a daze. When she pulled into the driveway, she saw an unfamiliar car, a flashy red convertible, parked next to Oliver's sedan. She walked into the house to find a scene that looked like an intervention. Margaret sat on the high-backed velvet armchair, looking like a queen on a throne. Oliver sat on the sofa, head in his hands. Mr. Henderson, the lawyer, was present, along with a stack of documents on the coffee table. "Sit down, Hannah," Margaret said. Her voice wasn't shrill today. It was calm, deadly, and final. Hannah didn't sit. She stood by the door, clutching her purse. "You stole my money, Margaret." "I consolidated family assets," Margaret corrected, unbothered. "Assets that you have been hoarding, while my son struggles to maintain the lifestyle he deserves. I earned that money, and I've been paying your bills for 5 years, Hannah shouted, her composure cracking. Oliver's gambling? The mortgage payments you missed? That was me. Lies, Oliver mumbled, refusing to look at her. What did you say? Hannah looked at her husband. Oliver looked up, his eyes red. Mom showed me the statements, Hannah. You've been siphoning money from the family accounts into your own. That's why we're broke. She found the paper trail. Hannah stared at him, mouth agape. Oliver, you know that isn't true. I'm an accountant. I fix the books. I don't cook them. Your mother is gaslighting you. Mr. Henderson has reviewed the evidence, Margaret interjected smoothly. She slid a folder across the table. Hannah opened it. It was a fabrication, a masterclass in forgery, fake invoices, doctored bank statements. It made it look like Hannah had been embezzling from the Street James Trust to fund a secret life. It was clumsy work to a trained eye, but to Oliver, who barely knew how to log into online banking, it looked damning. We are prepared to overlook the criminal charges, Mr. Henderson said, his voice heavy with false sympathy. Margaret Mrs. Street James wishes to avoid a scandal. However, she insists on an immediate separation. Divorce, Margaret corrected. Irreconcilable differences. And since you have clearly stolen enough, you will leave with what you came with. Nothing. Hannah looked at Oliver. You believe this? After everything I've done? I sold my jewelry to pay off your bookie in Jersey, Oliver. I saved you from getting your legs broken. Don't talk about that, Oliver snapped, standing up. You never believed in me, Hannah. Mom says you've been holding me back. You're jealous of my potential. Potential? Hannah laughed, a dry, humorless sound. Oliver, you're 34 years old and you still ask your mother for permission to buy new tires. Get out. Margaret stood up, pointing a manicured finger at the door. Get out of my house. I have already packed your bags. They are on the porch. Hannah looked around the room. She looked at the crown molding she had paid to restore, the antique rug she had cleaned herself. Then she looked at the three people staring back at her, a tyrant, a coward, and a shark. She realized then that fighting this, trying to prove her innocence to people committed to misunderstanding her, was a waste of energy. She had her skills, she had her integrity, and she knew exactly where the bodies were buried, in the Street James financial records. She closed the folder. Okay, Hannah said. The room went silent. They had expected screaming, begging, maybe a fainting spell. Okay? Oliver asked, sounding almost disappointed. If you want a divorce, Oliver, you can have it. But I want my grandmother's money back. The $45,000. Consider it restitution for the emotional distress you've caused this family, Margaret scoffed. You get nothing. Now leave before I call the police and have you removed for trespassing. Hannah nodded slowly. She looked Margaret dead in the eye. You win, Margaret. You get your son back. You get the house. You get full control of the finances. I hope you're ready for what that actually means. I have managed this family since before you were born, Margaret sneered. No, Hannah said softly. You haven't managed it. You've just spent it. I was the one managing it. Hannah turned and walked out the front door. On the porch, 2 suitcases were thrown haphazardly. It was raining. She dragged her bags to her car, a modest sedan she had bought before the marriage. As she loaded the trunk, she saw the curtains in the living room twitch. Margaret was watching. Hannah got into the driver's seat, wet and shivering. She took out her phone. She had $0 in her checking account. She had no place to stay. But as she put the key in the ignition, she didn't feel fear. She felt a strange lightness. The weight of the sinking ship was no longer hers to carry. She drove away, leaving the Street James Manor glowing warmly in the rearview mirror. Inside, Margaret poured 3 glasses of the good scotch. To new beginnings, Margaret toasted, clinking glasses with a sullen Oliver and a smiling Mr. Henderson. And to Tiffany, I've invited her for dinner tomorrow, Oliver. Do try to be charming. She's the kind of woman who can actually help this family. Yeah, Oliver muttered, sipping his drink. She's great. Margaret sat back, satisfied. She had excised the cancer. She had won. She didn't notice the stack of unpaid property tax, notices that Hannah had been keeping in a specific drawer in the kitchen, the drawer Hannah usually cleared out on Fridays. Margaret didn't know that the family trust was actually an empty shell that Hannah had been frantically patching with her own freelance income. And she certainly didn't know that by kicking Hannah out, she had just fired the only person who knew the passwords to the offshore accounts. Oliver's father had hidden accounts that required biometric verification from a designated trustee, a trustee named Hannah Bennett. For the first 3 nights, Hannah slept in her car. She parked in the back lot of a 24-hour superstore, reclining the driver's seat of her sedan and covering herself with the few coats she had managed to grab. She wouldn't go to her parents. They were retired in Florida, living on a fixed pension, and the shame of telling them she had been discarded, like trash, was too heavy to bear. On the 4th day, she pawned her engagement ring. Margaret had always sneered at it. A modest, quarter-carat diamond Oliver had bought when he was actually trying to make it on his own, before he folded and went back to his mother's teat. It wasn't worth much to the pawnbroker, just enough for a month at the Sleepasy Inn, a roadside motel on the outskirts of town, where the neon sign buzzed incessantly and the carpet smelled of stale cigarettes and regret. Hannah set up her office on the wobbly laminate desk in room 104. She had her laptop, her hotspot, and a list of contacts she had built over 6 years of fixing the Street James family's messes. She sent out 20 emails that morning. She didn't ask for charity, she offered services. Forensic accounting, asset tracing, crisis financial management. By noon, she was eating a cup of instant noodles when her phone rang. Hannah? The voice was gravelly and sharp. It was Leonard Leo Kincaid. Hannah sat up straighter. Leo was a self-made real estate mogul who despised the Greenwich old money social circle. He had been a rival of Oliver's father years ago. Margaret called him that vulgar bricklayer. Mr. Kincaid, Hannah said, clearing her throat. Thank you for calling. I heard a rumor, Leo said. Word on the street is the Street James empire is undergoing a restructuring. And by restructuring, I hear Margaret kicked you out. Is that true? We have parted ways. Yes, Hannah said, professionally. Good, Leo grunted. Best thing that could happen to you. Listen, I know you were the one who found the tax loop regarding the waterfront development last year. Oliver tried to take credit, but that boy can't count to 10 without taking off his shoes. I need someone to look at my holdings in Europe. My current accountants are too slow. You interested? I am, Hannah said, her heart pounding. Can you start tomorrow? I don't care where you work from, as long as the numbers are right. I can start now, Hannah replied. Good. I'm wiring you a retainer. 5,000. Don't let me down. When the notification hit her phone 5 minutes later, Hannah stared at the screen and wept. It wasn't the millions the Street James family claimed to have, but it was hers. Meanwhile, at the Street James estate, the mood was euphoric, or rather, frantically manic. Tiffany Vanderbilt had officially moved in for the weekend 2 weeks ago and hadn't left. Her suitcases massive, Louis Vuitton trunks lined the hallway, scratching the hardwood floors that Hannah used to polish by hand. Oh, Ollie, this living room is just so drab, Tiffany complained, draping herself over the sofa. She was scrolling through Pinterest on her phone. It smells like old people. We need to modernize. White leather, glass tables, minimalist. Oliver, who was currently nursing a hangover at 11 a.m., nodded vaguely. Whatever you want, babe. Mom said we need to update the image anyway. Margaret walked in, wearing a fresh Chanel suit, looking triumphant. She had just returned from a lunch where she had hinted to the ladies of the club that Hannah had been let go due to mental instability. Update away, Margaret declared. I've always hated these drapes. Hannah insisted on preserving the historical integrity of the house. Boring. Get rid of them. And the staff? Tiffany asked. I mean, the cleaning lady comes twice a week, but who's doing the cooking? We've ordered takeout every night. My skin is going to break out. Margaret waved a hand dismissively. I'm interviewing private chefs next week. Until then, we can dine at the club, or Oliver can grill. He's excellent at the grill. Oliver looked up, alarmed. I am? I mean, yeah, sure. He hadn't touched the grill in 5 years. Hannah used to prep the meat, marinate it, set the temperature, and then hand Oliver the tongs right before guests arrived, so he could look like the hero. It will be a new era, Margaret said, pouring herself a midday sherry. The era of Street James brilliance. No more penny pinching. She walked to the antique secretary desk, where Hannah used to keep the household ledger. Margaret opened the drawer, expecting to find the organized stack of bills and the checkbook. Instead, she found a single sticky note in Hannah's handwriting. Trash collection is Tuesdays. If you miss it, the fine is $50. Alarm code is 7749. Good luck. Margaret crumpled the note. Petty, she muttered. She sat down to pay the electric bill. She logged into the online portal, or tried to. The password she thought she knew didn't work. She tried. Margaret 1, Stent James 1, nothing. Oliver, she yelled. What is the password for the electric company? I don't know, Oliver called back from the living room, where he was massaging Tiffany's feet. Hannah handled all that. Well, call the company and reset it. I can't, Mom. The account is in your name, but Hannah set up the two-factor authentication to her phone number. Margaret growled. Fine. I'll just wait for the paper bill. She didn't worry. She had the $45,000 she had seized from Hannah, plus the monthly stipend from the trust. They were rich. They were untouchable. She didn't notice that the trust stipend usually arrived on the 1st of the month. It was now the 5th, and the deposit hadn't cleared. She assumed it was a bank holiday delay. Tiffany, darling, Margaret called out, shaking off the annoyance. Why don't you book that interior designer you mentioned? The expensive one? Yay, Tiffany squealed. You're the best, Maggie, Margaret smiled. Being called Maggie grated on her, but Tiffany's father was a senator. It was a fair trade. 3 weeks later, the Street James mansion was undergoing a transformation. The historic oak paneling in the dining room was being painted a blinding, sterile white. The antique Persian rugs were rolled up in a corner, replaced by fluffy, impractical white shag carpets that Tiffany adored. But there was a smell. It was faint at first, a sort of sickly sweet rot wafting from the kitchen. Oliver, did you take the trash out? Margaret asked, holding a handkerchief to her nose as she entered the kitchen. The kitchen was a disaster zone. Dirty dishes were piled in the sink because no one knew how to fix the dishwasher, which had flashed an error code E4 3 days ago. Hannah usually fixed it with a specific wrench she kept under the sink. Oliver had tried to fix it by kicking it. I took the bags to the curb on Wednesday, Oliver said defensively. He was eating cereal out of a coffee mug because there were no clean bowls. Trash day is Tuesday, Margaret snapped. I told you that. I forgot, okay? I've been busy helping Tiffany pick out chandeliers. Well, the garage smells like a slaughterhouse. Deal with it. Why can't the gardener do it? Oliver whined. Because, Margaret said, her voice tight. We don't have a gardener right now. Mr. Henderson is still trying to find a service that doesn't charge extortionate rates. The truth was, the gardening service had come once, looked at the overgrown, complex topiaries that required specialized care, and quoted $4,000 a month. Margaret had screamed at them to leave. She didn't realize that Hannah did the topiaries herself. Fine, Oliver grumbled. He went to the garage. Margaret turned to the refrigerator. She opened it, looking for the chilled, sparkling water she loved. The fridge was warm. No, she whispered. She tapped the light. Nothing. She checked the microwave clock. Blank. The power was out. Oliver! She shrieked. Oliver ran back in. What? Did you see a rat? The electricity. It's off. Maybe a fuse blew. Go check the breaker box. Oliver went to the basement. He came back up 2 minutes later, looking pale. Breakers are fine, but there's a tag on the meter outside. A red tag. A red tag? Disconnected for non-payment, Oliver said. Margaret's face turned purple. That's impossible. I sent the check. You sent a check? Oliver asked. I thought you were waiting for the password reset. I mailed a check 10 days ago, Margaret yelled, to the address on the old bill I found. Mom, Oliver said slowly, that bill was from 3 years ago. They changed providers last year. Hannah switched us to Green Energy Co. because it was cheaper. Silence descended on the kitchen, broken only by the sound of Tiffany entering the room, wearing a silk kimono. "Why is the Wi-Fi down?" Tiffany asked, annoyed. "I'm trying to upload a story." "We have a slight and technical difficulty," Margaret said, smoothing her skirt. "Oliver, go to the hotel downtown. Get us a suite. Just for tonight until I straighten this clerical error out." "A suite?" Oliver checked his banking app. "Mom, I have like $200 in my account. Tiffany wanted that vintage purse yesterday, remember? Use the emergency credit card," Margaret commanded. "The Amex?" Oliver pulled it out. "Okay." He called the hotel. He spoke for a moment, read the numbers, and then paused. His face fell. "Declined?" he whispered. He looked at his mother. "Mom, they say the card is over the limit. Give me that phone." Margaret snatched it. She dialed the bank concierge, the VIP line. "This is Margaret Street, James. My card was just declined. Fix it immediately." "One moment. Mrs. Street, James," the polite voice said. After a brief hold, the rep returned. "I see the issue. The automatic payment for the credit card was returned for insufficient funds." "Insufficient funds?" Margaret laughed, a hysterical edge to it. "Check the Street James Family Trust account. Transfer the money from there." "I'm looking at the trust account, ma'am. It currently has a balance of 0. Margaret felt the room spin. "That's a lie. My husband left millions in the offshore holdings. The monthly dividend is $20,000. "I can see the offshore holding link, ma'am," the rep said. "But the funds are locked. There is a trustee verification hold on the principal account. I am the beneficiary." "Yes, but you are not the trustee. The account requires biometric verification from the designated trustee to release the dividends. That hasn't been performed this month, so the system auto-locked." "Who is the trustee?" Margaret demanded. Though she already knew the answer, it made her bile rise. "The system lists Hannah Bennett." Margaret hung up the phone. She stared at the wall. "What is it?" Tiffany asked, actually looking concerned for the first time, mostly because she couldn't post her selfie. "That little witch," Margaret hissed. "She locked the money." "Hannah?" Oliver asked. "She stole it?" "Worse, she froze it. She's the only one who can unlock the transfers. She's holding our money hostage." Margaret grabbed her purse. "Oliver, get the car. We are going to find her." "Where is she?" "Mr. Henderson tracked her down yesterday. She's renting an office in the financial district. Can you believe the audacity? Using my money to rent an office?" An hour later, Margaret and Oliver stormed into the lobby of a sleek, glass-walled building downtown. They bypassed security by acting like they owned the place. A tactic that usually worked, but today resulted in a security guard following them into the elevator. They found Suite 402. The door was frosted glass with gold lettering, HB Financial Forensics. Margaret threw the door open. It wasn't a dingy little room. It was a bright, modern office with a view of the skyline. There were 3 other people working at desks, assistants, associates, and there, in the corner office, behind a large oak desk, sat Hannah. She was wearing a sharp crimson blazer, a color she never wore at the mansion because Margaret said it was too aggressive. She looked healthy. She looked powerful. She was on the phone. She looked up, saw the Street James duo, and held up a finger. "No, Leo, that's fine. We can restructure the debt to equity. I'll have the papers by 5. Goodbye." She hung up and leaned back in her chair. She didn't stand. "Margaret, Oliver, to what do I owe the pleasure? Did you run out of clean socks?" "You thief!" Margaret screamed, stepping forward. The security guard from the lobby stepped in front of her. "Ma'am, lower your voice," the guard warned. "She stole our money." Margaret pointed a shaking finger at Hannah. "Unlock the accounts, Hannah, right now, or I will have you arrested for embezzlement." Hannah laughed. It was a genuine, full laugh. "Embezzlement? Margaret, please. I didn't touch your money. The bank in the Caymans did. Because you didn't authorize the transfer." "Correct," Hannah said calmly. "Because I am no longer the wife of Oliver Street James. Therefore, I am no longer the acting trustee. I cannot perform duties for a family I am not part of. Then sign the rights over to me, Margaret demanded. Hannah picked up a pen and twirled it. I'd love to, really, but there's a catch. Oliver's father, rest his soul, was a paranoid man. The trust bylaws state that the trustee must be a non-blood relative by marriage to prevent. Well, exactly what you're doing, spending the principal. So appoint someone else, Oliver shouted. Appoint Tiffany, Hannah raised an eyebrow. Tiffany, I can't just appoint someone. To change the trustee, there has to be a board meeting of the offshore directors, in person, in the Cayman Islands, which costs about $10,000 in legal fees and travel. Then go, Margaret yelled. Why should I? Hannah asked, her voice dropping to a cool steeliness. Why should I spend my time and money to help you? You threw me out. You stole my $45,000. You slandered me to our friends. We need that money, Hannah, Oliver pleaded, his bravado crumbling. The power is out. Tiffany is freaking out. Tiffany is freaking out, Hannah repeated slowly. Well, that certainly breaks my heart. She stood up. Here is the reality, Margaret. You are asset-rich and cash-poor. You have a mansion you can't afford to run, a car you can't afford to gas up, and a son who can't afford to buy a sandwich. I tried to warn you for years. I budgeted. I scrimped. I fixed the leak so the ship wouldn't sink. You threw the captain overboard, and now you're surprised you're drowning? I want my money, Margaret seethed, her eyes wet with rage. It's not your money, Hannah corrected. It's the trust's. And right now, the trust is protecting itself from you. That biometrics lock? It triggers a full audit if a transfer is missed. The bank is currently reviewing every transaction from the last 10 years. And do you know what they're going to find? Margaret went pale. They're going to find that you've been dipping into the principal for personal expenses that weren't authorized, Hannah said, which I used to cover up for you. I used to recategorize your spa trips as medical expenses and your galas as networking events. I'm not there to do that anymore. You set me up, Margaret whispered. No, Hannah said. I just stopped saving you. Hannah looked at the security guard. Dave, please escort Mr. and Mrs. Street James out. I have work to do. You can't do this, Margaret screamed as Dave took her arm. I am a Street James. Yes, Hannah said, sitting back down and opening a file. And that's all you are. As they were dragged out, Hannah didn't look up, but as soon as the door closed, she let out a long, shaky breath. She looked at her computer screen. She had lied about one thing. She could appoint a temporary trustee remotely. It would take one email. She deleted the draft. The silence in the Street James mansion was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating, and cold. Without electricity, the massive house had become a tomb. The perishables in the refrigerator had long since been thrown out by Oliver, who gagged the entire time, and they were living off takeout pizza eaten by candlelight. It had been 4 days since the confrontation in Hannah's office. 4 days of Margaret calling every lawyer in her Rolodex, only to be met with polite refusals or disconnected numbers. It seemed the rumor mill in Greenwich moved faster than light. Everyone knew the street. James' fortune was frozen, and nobody wanted to board a sinking ship. Tiffany was the first to crack. It was a Tuesday morning. The sunlight streamed through the dirty windows, illuminating the dust that was accumulating on the grand piano. Oliver walked into the living room, holding a lukewarm cup of instant coffee he'd made using water heated on the outdoor grill. Tiff? He called out. I was thinking, maybe we could go for a drive today, just to get out of here? I have enough gas to get to the coast. There was no answer. Oliver walked up the sweeping staircase. Tiffany? He pushed open the door to the guest suite she had claimed. The room was empty. Not just empty of her, empty of everything. Her Louis Vuitton trunks were gone. The silk sheets she had insisted they buy were stripped from the bed. The vanity, usually cluttered with expensive creams and perfumes, was bare. Oliver felt a cold pit in his stomach. He ran to the closet. Empty. He ran to his mother's room. Margaret was still asleep, huddled under 3 duvets. Mom, wake up. Oliver shook her. Margaret groaned, her face without makeup looking gray and aged. What is it, Oliver? Have they turned the power back on? Tiffany's gone. What? Margaret sat up. Don't be silly. She probably went to the spa. Her bags are gone, Mom. Everything is gone. Margaret threw off the covers and rushed to her own dressing room. She let out a scream that echoed through the empty halls. My jewelry box. Oliver ran in. The antique rosewood box that held the street. James' heirlooms, the diamond brooches, the pearl strings, the sapphire ring that had belonged to his great-grandmother was smashed open on the floor. It was empty. She robbed us, Margaret whispered, her voice trembling with a rage so pure it was almost silent. That little gutter rat. She robbed us. But she's a Vanderbilt, Oliver stammered. She has money. Why would she steal yours? Because she's not a Vanderbilt, you idiot, Margaret shrieked, turning on him. I just called Jessica. It turns out, Tiffany is Jessica's stepdaughter's college roommate, who's been couch surfing for months. Jessica thought she was staying with us out of charity. She's a grifter, Oliver, a con artist. And you let her into our home. Me? Oliver yelled back. You're the one who said she was the perfect woman. You said she had pedigree. I was trying to save you from that boring accountant. That boring accountant never stole a dime, Oliver shouted. That boring accountant made sure the alarm system worked. Do you know why the alarm didn't go off when Tiffany left? Because the service was cut yesterday. They stood there, panting, the truth finally settling between them like a toxic fog. They were broke, they had been robbed, and they were alone. Later that afternoon, the final blow arrived. It wasn't a phone call, it was a knock on the door. Two men in dark suits stood on the porch, flanked by a sheriff's deputy. Margaret St. F. James? One of the men asked. He held a leather portfolio. Yes? Margaret smoothed her hair, trying to summon her old imperious demeanor. To what do I owe this intrusion? I'm Special Agent Miller from the IRS, and this is Mr. Crowley from the Bank of the Caymans. We are here to serve a warrant for the seizure of assets. Margaret grabbed the doorframe. Seizure? On what grounds? Fraud, Mr. Crowley said calmly. The audit triggered by the frozen trust account revealed significant discrepancies. It appears that for the last 7 years, you have been withdrawing principal funds by forging the trustee's signature on digital release forms. That is a felony, Mrs. Street James. That's a misunderstanding, Margaret gasped. We also have evidence of tax evasion, Agent Miller added. You haven't reported the liquidations of the summer home or the vintage car collection. The penalties and back taxes amount to 3 times the remaining value of the estate. So what does this mean? Oliver asked, stepping forward, his voice small. It means, the sheriff's deputy said, stepping up, that this property is now under the control of the federal government. You have 24 hours to vacate the premises. Margaret looked at the men, then at the manicured lawn, the winding driveway, the life she had built on a foundation of lies and arrogance. Vacate? She whispered. But where will we go? The agent shrugged. That is not our concern, ma'am. The eviction of the Street James family was swift and humiliating. Because they had no money for movers, they could only take what they could carry and fit into Oliver's sedan, which was also likely to be repossessed soon. It was raining again. The weather seemed to be conspiring with their misery. Margaret sat in the passenger seat of the car, clutching a plastic bag filled with her remaining clothes. She wore a fur coat, looking absurdly out of place, as Oliver loaded a box of kitchen utensils into the trunk. Neighbors watched from behind their curtains. No one came out to help. The bridge club ladies, the charity board members, the people Margaret had preened in front of for decades they all knew. And in the brutal social calculus of Greenwich, a fallen queen is just a beggar in a fur coat. They drove to a motel, not the Sleep Easy, where Hannah had stayed, but a place even further out of town, where they accepted cash and didn't ask for a credit card hold. For the next 2 months, life was a blur of misery. Oliver got a job at a car wash. It was the only place that would hire him quickly. The consultant who used to spend his days golfing was now scrubbing mud off tires for minimum wage. His hands were chapped and raw. Margaret, however, refused to adapt. She spent her days in the motel room, watching daytime TV, insisting that this was just a temporary setback and that Mr. Henderson would find a loophole. But Mr. Henderson had fired them as clients after his bill went unpaid for the third month. One evening, Oliver came back to the motel room, smelling of industrial soap and exhaustion. He threw a bag of fast food on the table. "I saw her," Oliver said, slumping into the chair. Margaret didn't look up from the TV. "Saw who? Tiffany? If you saw that thief, tell me you called the police." "No, Hannah." Margaret stiffened. "Don't say her name." "I saw her. She pulled into the car wash. She has a new car, a nice one, German." Margaret turned slowly. "Did she see you?" "Yeah." Oliver swallowed hard. "She saw me. I was wiping down her rims." The room went silent. The humiliation hung in the air, thick and choking. "What did she say?" Margaret whispered. "Did she gloat? Did she laugh?" "No," Oliver said, staring at his hands. "She rolled down the window. She looked at me, and she looked sad. Mom, just sad. She handed me a $20 tip, and she said, 'Keep the change, Oliver. Buy your mother something to eat.'" Oliver reached into his pocket and pulled out the crisp $20 bill. He placed it on the sticky table. Margaret stared at the money. It was charity. It was pity. From the woman she had called a leech. "She's mocking us," Margaret hissed, tears welling in her eyes. "She's laughing at us." "She's not laughing, Mom." Oliver slammed his hand on the table, finally snapping. "She's winning. She won, because she actually knows how to work. She knows how to survive. You called her useless, but she was the only reason we weren't in this dump 5 years ago." "I did what I had to do for this family," Margaret screamed. "You destroyed this family," Oliver shouted back, standing up. "You made me divorce the only person who ever actually loved me for me, not for the name. You filled my head with garbage about Tiffany and status. And now look at us. I'm washing tires, and you're eating a cheeseburger in a room that smells like mildew." He grabbed his coat. "Where are you going?" Margaret cried out, suddenly looking small and terrified. "I'm going for a walk," Oliver said. I need to be away from you." He slammed the door. Margaret was left alone with the buzzing neon sign outside the window and the $20 bill on the table. She reached out and took the money. Her hand shook. She wept, not for the son she had driven away, but for the realization that she had become exactly what she despised: poor. 2 years later, the heavy, cream-colored cardstock invitation sat on the desk, embossed with gold leaf. It looked almost identical to the ones Hannah had been forced to hand address for Margaret's summer gala 3 years ago. But there was one crucial difference. This time, the invitation didn't say, "The Street James Family." It read, "The Bennett and Kincaid Foundation Annual Charity Ball." Hannah Bennett stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of her corner office in Manhattan, looking down at the city lights that glittered like scattered diamonds. She adjusted the cuff of her crimson silk blazer, the same shade Margaret had once called too aggressive, but which the business world now recognized as the color of a woman who didn't lose. She was no longer just a forensic accountant. She was a partner in one of the city's most feared financial consulting firms. She had rebuilt her life, not with old money or family names, but with the cold, hard steel of competence. Her phone buzzed on the glass desk. It was 7 p.m. She was supposed to meet David, a pediatric heart surgeon who treated her like a queen rather than a servant, in 20 minutes. But the caller ID made her pause. Unknown number. Usually, she let these go to voicemail, but tonight, a strange intuition pricked at her. She picked it up. "This is Hannah." There was a silence on the other end. A long, heavy silence, filled with the sound of traffic and wind, as if the person was standing outside a payphone or on a busy street corner. "Han?" The voice was rough, aged by smoke and stress, but she recognized it instantly. It was Oliver, but not the Oliver who played golf in pressed khakis. This Oliver sounded like a man who had been ground down to the bone. "Oliver," Hannah said. Her voice was steady. Her heart didn't race. Her palms didn't sweat. She felt nothing but a distant curiosity. I didn't think you'd pick up, Oliver stammered. I saw you, in the paper. Businesswoman of the Year. You look incredible. Thank you, Hannah said coolly. What do you want, Oliver? I don't want money, he said quickly, a defensive edge creeping in. I know I have no right. I wanted you to know. About Mom. Hannah turned away from the window. What about her? She's gone, Hannah. I mean, she's alive, but she's not there anymore. Oliver's voice cracked. After the eviction, she couldn't handle the motel. She stopped eating. She started talking to people who weren't there. I had to put her in a state-run facility in Newark, Oak Creek County home. Hannah knew the place. It was underfunded, overcrowded, and smelled of bleach and despair. It was the kind of place Margaret Street James would have once driven past with her nose wrinkled in disgust. She thinks she's at the Hamptons house, Oliver continued, quietly weeping now. She wears a string of plastic beads she got from a craft activity and tells the nurses to prepare the lobster bisque. She tells everyone she's waiting for her daughter-in-law to bring the mail. She asks for you, Hannah. She forgets she hated you. She just remembers you were the only one who got things done. Hannah closed her eyes. The image of Margaret, the woman who had terrorized her, criticized her calligraphy, and stolen her inheritance, sitting in a plastic chair in a gray room, barking orders at indifferent orderlies, was a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. It was the ultimate foreclosure, the foreclosure of the mind. And you, Oliver? Hannah asked. Where are you? I'm driving a delivery truck for a furniture warehouse, he said. It's hard work. My back is shot. But I pay my own rent. A studio apartment in Queens. It's small, but it's mine. He paused. I saw Tiffany last week. She was on the cover of a magazine. She married some duke in Europe. She got away with everything. Some people do, Hannah said softly. For a while. I'm sorry, Hannah, Oliver whispered. I know it's too late, but I am so sorry. I should have defended you. I should have been the husband you deserved. I threw away a diamond to pick up a piece of broken glass. Hannah looked at her reflection in the darkened window. She saw a woman who was whole. A woman who had walked through the fire and came out refined, not burnt. You're right, Oliver, she said. It is too late, but I appreciate the call. Can I ever see you? He asked, a shred of hope in his voice. Just for coffee? To catch up? Hannah looked at the clock. David was waiting. Her life was waiting. No, Oliver, she said firmly. We don't have anything to catch up on. The books are closed. She hung up the phone. She didn't block the number. She didn't need to. She simply set the phone down, picked up her clutch, and walked out of the office. As she stepped into the elevator, she thought about Margaret in the nursing home, waiting for a gala that would never happen. She thought about Oliver hauling furniture in the rain. For a brief second, she felt a pang of pity. But then she remembered the freezing living room. She remembered the empty bank account. She remembered being tossed out like garbage. She smiled as the elevator doors opened to the lobby, where David was waiting with a bouquet of lilies. Karma hadn't just come for the Street James family. It had come for her, too, and it had brought gifts. Hannah Bennett walked out into the cool night air, leaving the ghosts in the past where they belonged. The ledger was finally balanced. Margaret St. James learned the hardest lesson of all. Arrogance is a loan with a high interest rate, and eventually, life comes to collect. By valuing appearance over substance and control over love, she not only bankrupted her family financially, but emotionally. She sacrificed a loyal daughter-in-law for a fantasy of prestige, only to find that the leech she despised was the only thing holding her world together. This story is a reminder that true wealth isn't found in bank accounts or last names, but in character, resilience, and how we treat those who support us. When you tear down the people who hold you up, don't be surprised when the roof caves in on you. If you enjoyed this story of justice and karma, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and tell me in the comments, do you think Hannah should have called Oliver back?